For decades, they've appeared silently, without warning, above the world's most dangerous places. Nuclear missile sites, weapons silos, command bunkers. Each time the systems fail and the lights return to the sky, what are they watching? What do they know? Welcome to Great Night Stories, where the hidden becomes softly spoken. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let the story unfold. Tonight, we drift into the mystery behind one of the most persistent questions in modern history. Why do UFOs always visit nuclear bases? Chapter 1. Echoes from the Cold War. In the final months of World War II, something irreversible was set in motion. On July 16, 1945, in the deserts of New Mexico, a sudden light broke the stillness of the early morning sky. The Trinity test, the world's first detonation of a nuclear weapon, marked not only the beginning of the atomic age, but some believe the beginning of another phenomenon altogether. Barely 2 years later, in 1947, a small town in New Mexico would become the center of global speculation: the Roswell incident. Though the U.S. military swiftly declared the debris discovered on a ranch was nothing more than a weather balloon, the original press release mentioned the recovery of a flying disc. It was a confusing and quickly retracted statement, but it planted a seed, the idea that something unknown was sharing our skies. What followed was a strange parallel. As nuclear weapons were developed, tested, and stockpiled across the globe, reports of unidentified flying objects that moved with uncanny speed and precision, began to rise. In 1949, just 4 years after the Trinity explosion, a confidential FBI memo, known today as the Memo 6751, was circulated internally. It mentioned flying saucers and suggested they were not terrestrial in origin. Though the memo remains controversial, it signaled a shift in how seriously these sightings were being considered behind closed doors. At the same time, Project Sign was initiated by the U.S. Air Force, the first official investigation into what were then called flying discs. It was followed closely by Project Grudge and later Project Blue Book. But while these programs were beginning to take shape, something subtler was happening across the country. At nuclear research labs, testing sites, and military bases, personnel began quietly reporting sightings of objects behaving in ways no known aircraft could. At Los Alamos, where many of the brightest minds of the Manhattan Project had once worked, scientists began witnessing strange lights hovering over restricted zones. The sightings were often dismissed as atmospheric anomalies or misidentified aircraft. Yet the consistency in reports, silent, hovering, disc-shaped, became difficult to ignore. Meanwhile, In the Nevada desert, where nuclear weapons were now being tested regularly, security teams were logging reports of small, glowing orbs moving over the test range just before and after detonations. Radar operators sometimes tracked objects performing aerial maneuvers beyond the capacity of jets at the time. Again, these were quietly archived, not openly discussed. The link between these sightings and nuclear activity might have gone unnoticed had it not been for patterns. Each time a major test occurred, particularly in the US, waves of sightings seemed to follow in surrounding regions. The timeline continued this way through the late 1940s and into the 1950s. When the Soviet Union successfully detonated its first atomic bomb in 1949, US intelligence noted increased reports of unusual aerial phenomena, not only in America, but globally. In 1952, Washington, D.C. experienced a now famous event. Over several consecutive nights in July, radar operators at both Washington National Airport and Andrews Air Force Base tracked unknown objects entering restricted airspace. Jets were scrambled, but by the time they arrived, the objects vanished. When the jets left, the objects returned. This incident became front-page news, prompting the Air Force to hold an unprecedented press conference to calm public concern. Again, this happened during a period of accelerated nuclear development. To some within the military, the connection became harder to ignore. Internally, briefings began to acknowledge that a disproportionate number of UFO sightings were occurring in or near nuclear sites, not just weapons facilities, but power plants and research installations. Still, for the public, the story remained fragmented. Project Blue Book, which would go on to investigate more than 12,000 cases by the end of its life in 1969, officially concluded that most sightings had conventional explanations, but hundreds remained unexplained. In many of those, nuclear connections were noted quietly in the case files. It wasn't until decades later, after the Cold War began to wind down, that former officials started speaking out. Retired officers who had been stationed at missile silos, security personnel who guarded classified locations, pilots who had chased the unknown. Their accounts, often delivered in measured tones without grand claims, carried the same quiet detail. Strange lights hovering over silos, systems shutting down without cause, radar signatures appearing and disappearing in ways no known aircraft could replicate, and always the same recurring question: why here? Why at sites holding the most destructive weapons ever built? As the 1940s gave way to the 1950s, the Cold War deepened. Nuclear arsenals expanded, secrecy intensified, and public interest in UFOs grew. Popular culture fed into the narrative. But beneath the surface, a more serious pattern was forming. At the heart of it was an unsettling observation. Wherever the world's most powerful weapons were stored, tested, or prepared, something else seemed to be watching. The first chapter of this story is not about answers. It is about alignment, timelines that overlap, incidents that repeat, and a silent connection that began in the desert with a blinding flash of light and a sudden new presence in the skies. Chapter 2: The Malmstrom Mystery. On the morning of March 24th, 1967, deep beneath the plains of Montana, something happened that is echoed through military records and personal memories for over half a century. It did not involve an explosion, a weapon test, or a conflict. But it did involve nuclear weapons and something uninvited in the sky above. Malmstrom Air Force Base, located near Great Falls, Montana, was and still is one of the primary sites for housing and operating intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. In the 1960s, it managed hundreds of Minuteman missiles, each capable of carrying a nuclear warhead across continents. These were weapons designed for deterrence, silent, buried deep underground in launch silos, ready for activation only under the gravest circumstances. On that quiet morning in March, Air Force Captain Robert Salas was stationed at the Oscar Flight Launch Control Center, approximately 60 feet underground. Along with another officer, he was overseeing a group of Minuteman missiles, all standing by in alert status. According to Salas's own account, which he later shared publicly and in interviews, a security guard called him via the intercom from above ground. The guard was audibly shaken. He reported strange lights in the sky, red, glowing, hovering silently, and moving with agility that didn't match any known aircraft. At first, Salas dismissed it. Perhaps the guard had mistaken a helicopter or a star. But minutes later, the call came again. This time, the guard's voice was panicked. The object was now directly above the front gate. It was large, red, pulsating. And then something unprecedented began to unfold below. One by one, the missiles under Salas's command began to go offline. Salas recalled looking at the missile status board as the lights changed from green to red, each missile going from alert to no-go. Within seconds, nearly 10 missiles had become disabled. Each missile was housed in its own underground silo, separated by miles, controlled by independent systems. Yet all failed in rapid succession. There was no explosion, no attack, no trace of mechanical failure that made immediate sense. Later investigation teams from Boeing and the Air Force were brought in. They could not identify any physical cause. Engineers found no signs of power surges or environmental disruption. The systems simply stopped functioning, as if something had overridden them. Salas was ordered to stay silent. The incident was classified, and for decades, it remained buried in the maze of official documentation and institutional memory. But the personnel involved did not forget. Years later, Salas began speaking out carefully and deliberately. He wasn't seeking headlines. His tone was consistent, calm, and professional. Others who had worked with him or nearby began coming forward as well. One of them was Lieutenant Colonel Dwin Arneson, who served as a communications officer at Malmstrom. He testified that reports of UFO activity during missile disruptions were not rare. Messages would circulate internally, flagged with urgency, but never released beyond classified circles. Another was Captain Eric Carlson, also stationed at Malmstrom, who confirmed that several missile shutdowns occurred during periods of reported aerial anomalies. The accounts, while varying in perspective, formed a steady pattern. Unknown aerial objects coincided with system failures that should have been impossible under normal conditions. What made the Malmstrom case distinct was not only the number of witnesses, but the presence of hard systems data. The missile status boards, the launch control logs, the subsequent inspections all confirmed that something abnormal had taken place. The Air Force did conduct an internal investigation. While the official summary acknowledged the shutdowns, it attributed the issue to an unknown electronic anomaly. The possibility of external interference was not ruled out, but neither was it pursued publicly. Years later, portions of documentation were obtained through the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA. Some pages were heavily redacted. Others provided fragments of technical analysis. In one memo, an officer expressed concern about system vulnerabilities in the presence of airborne unknowns. But no conclusions were presented, and no full explanation followed. In 2010, decades after the incident, Robert Salas testified at a press conference at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., alongside other retired military officials. The event was not a dramatic revelation, but rather a composed attempt to present the facts under oath in public. Salas reiterated the sequence: UFO sightings, followed by the unexplained disabling of nuclear weapon systems. Journalists asked whether he believed these were extraterrestrial craft. Salas answered cautiously. He didn't claim to know what the objects were, but he believed the connection between the sightings and the system failures was more than coincidence, and that the public had a right to know. Other officers at the press event shared similar stories from other bases and dates. But the Mistrum case stood out because of its documentation, its reliability, and the credibility of those involved. Skeptics have offered alternative explanations over the years. Some have suggested software faults, electromagnetic interference, or even internal sabotage. But no theory has accounted fully for the timing, the consistency, and the correlation with unidentified objects seen in the vicinity. At its core, the Mistrum incident is not just about a sighting. It is about a breach, not of defense lines or airspace, but a technological integrity. In an era when deterrence depended on readiness, the very systems designed to respond had gone silent without apparent cause. And in the skies above, according to trained observers, something unknown had been watching. To this day, Malmstrom remains active. Its silos still house some of the most powerful weapons on Earth. But those who were there in 1967 remember a day when power, precision, and protocol were momentarily overshadowed, not by a threat from another nation, but by something entirely different. The implications linger quietly, not in alarmist tones, but in the calm question that underlies many of these stories. If something has the capability to observe and even interact with our most secure weapon systems, then who is observing whom? Chapter 3: Incursions at Minette and beyond. In the early hours of October 24th, 1968, something unusual unfolded above the vast open plains surrounding Minette Air Force Base in North Dakota. The skies were clear, temperatures crisp, and visibility high, ideal conditions for observation. What took place that morning would become one of the most thoroughly documented and quietly puzzling encounters between unidentified aerial objects and a major U.S. nuclear facility. Minette AFB, like Malmstrom, Montana, was and remains home to a large fleet of intercontinental ballistic missiles. Hundreds of Minuteman ICBMs sat in silos buried across the countryside, monitored and guarded by teams of trained airmen and radar operators. The base itself was a critical node in America's nuclear deterrence posture during the Cold War. Shortly after 2:00 a.m., Airman First Class Bond and other security personnel patrolling one of the outer missile facilities reported seeing a strange luminous object hovering low in the sky. It emitted a pulsing light, alternately white and orange, and appeared to be maneuvering silently and without wings or rotor blades. Simultaneously, radar operators at the base detected an unidentified target. The object was fast, steady, and did not respond to radio contact or transponder queries. It moved in ways that didn't match any known aircraft, shifting altitude rapidly and executing tight turns without deceleration. At one point, The radar return showed it positioned directly above a nuclear missile silo. Witnesses described the craft as oval or disc-shaped, glowing, and seemingly intelligent in its movements. A B-52 bomber that had just completed a training run was veered toward the location to investigate. As it approached, the onboard radar picked up the same target, a solid return matching the ground-based radar feed. The B-52's electronic equipment briefly experienced disruptions, something noted by the crew, but not fully understood at the time. Back on the ground, a team of security airmen pursued the light across the countryside. One patrol vehicle reported being nearly underneath the object, which hovered for a moment before darting away at a speed no conventional aircraft could match. The movement was described as instantaneous. No build-up, no sound, no observable propulsion. As the morning wore on, the object disappeared from radar. By dawn, it was gone, but the reports had already begun filing in from radar rooms, cockpit voice logs, security teams, and field commanders. The Air Force's Office of Special Investigations, OSI, immediately took control of the incident. Personnel were debriefed. Statements were collected. The incident, unusual in its detail and corroboration across multiple systems, was logged internally. Project Blue Book, the Air Force's public F-facing UFO investigation program at the time, launched an inquiry. Despite the wealth of data, radar logs, flight crew accounts, ground observer statements, the final Blue Book summary concluded the object was a combination of stars, temperature inversions, and misidentified aircraft. Many of those involved quietly disagreed. Years later, declassified documents and taped interviews with Air Force personnel revealed a different tone. Radar technicians confirmed that the object had presented a solid radar return, meaning it was not an illusion or a reflection. Crew members of the B-52 emphasized that the object moved at speeds and with agility far beyond the capabilities of any known aircraft. In 1968, the Minette case stands out not just for the volume of evidence, but for the consistency across separate domains. Ground visual sightings, airborne crew reports, and radar confirmation all took place in and around a facility responsible for storing and managing nuclear weapons. But Minette was not an isolated case. Throughout the late 1960s, reports of unidentified objects near nuclear facilities were quietly mounting across the northern plains. In Wyoming, security teams at F.E. Warren Air Force Base reported seeing bright maneuvering lights above missile silos. Some incidents were filed away under routine logs, but others triggered elevated security alerts. In Montana, Separate from the earlier Malmstrom incident, additional reports surfaced in 1969 involving glowing orbs near the base perimeter. They hovered at fixed altitudes, then moved away without sound. Radar logs occasionally captured unknown targets, only for the returns to vanish suddenly. And across the Canadian border, Royal Canadian Air Force RCAF units near Cold Lake, Alberta, a known training area with nuclear weapons testing ties, also began recording incidents. In 1967, Canadian radar operators tracked a fast-moving object over restricted airspace. Pilots were sent to intercept, but the object climbed rapidly and disappeared. Unlike in the US, Canadian authorities made little public statement. The incidents were logged and filed under defense operations. What connected these sightings was more than geography. It was their proximity to high-S locations and their recurrence during times of heightened Cold War readiness. These weren't isolated visual reports. They often involved multiple observers, equipment logs, and military ray radar systems. And consistently, the objects displayed flight characteristics beyond conventional explanation. Over time, some investigators began to detect patterns. Many of these encounters occurred during routine missile maintenance operations, times when underground silos were opened, or weapons were being moved or inspected. Other incidents followed test exercises involving bomber flights with simulated nuclear payloads. In retrospect, these patterns suggested observation, or perhaps testing, but by whom and for what purpose remained uncertain. Official explanations continued to lean toward natural or human-made causes. Balloons, aircraft, stars refracted by atmospheric layers. Yet for many of those who saw these objects firsthand, these explanations fell flat. Captain James Pavitt, a radar officer who served during this period, later remarked in an interview, "These weren't hallucinations. These were tracked objects, tracked by equipment designed to monitor enemy missiles, not stars." The broader question lingered. If these objects weren't from adversarial nations, and no evidence ever emerged to suggest Soviet craft were involved, then what were they? Some dismissed the encounters as Cold War paranoia. Others considered them a side effect of classified aerospace testing. And yet, the sightings always seemed to occur where no secret aircraft were expected, and always near the world's most dangerous weapons. The Minay incident remains one of the most thoroughly studied military UFO encounters in American history. It has been cited in declassified intelligence summaries, presented at public hearings, and investigated by independent researchers. Despite this, no definitive conclusion has ever been offered. Perhaps that's because the event speaks not to one anomaly, but to a broader phenomenon. one that would continue to surface quietly and persistently wherever nuclear arms were stationed. The North Dakota skies have long since returned to silence, but in the memories of those who stood on duty that night, one fact remains unshaken. Something unknown entered a tightly controlled military zone, hovered above a missile facility, and left without a trace. And that something had no name. Chapter 4: Silence Over the Sea. The USS Franklin D. Roosevelt encounters. The open ocean offers no shelter, no distraction. Aboard an aircraft carrier, particularly in the 1950s and 60s, there were no city lights to pollute the sky. Only the horizon, the stars, and occasionally something else. The USS Franklin D. Roosevelt, a midway-ass aircraft carrier commissioned just after World War II, served as a key part of the U.S. Navy's strategic posture during the early decades of the Cold War. She carried dozens of fighter jets, reconnaissance planes, and at times, nuclear payloads. Between 1950 and 1975, she was deployed across the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and the Caribbean. And during those years, something unexplained seemed to follow her. It began subtly with scattered reports. In 1952, during maneuvers in the North Atlantic, several sailors reported seeing a bright object in the sky, large, silent, and disc-shaped. It remained visible for several minutes before vanishing. The incident was chalked up to reflections or visual misinterpretation common at sea, but more would follow. One of the most notable sightings occurred in 1958, while the USS Roosevelt was participating in NATO exercises. During a clear night off the coast of Portugal, multiple crew members spotted a glowing object hovering off the port side. At first, they believed it to be an aircraft, possibly a Soviet reconnaissance plane, but the object didn't move like any plane they knew. It stayed motionless for over 5 minutes, pulsing with a bluish light before accelerating and disappearing into the sky at an angle that defied normal aerodynamics. No sound, no heat wake, no radar signature, despite active tracking systems on the ship. The encounter was noted internally, but not discussed publicly. In 1962, another incident took place. This one during a deployment near Guantanamo Bay. Several officers, including a Navy photographer, reported seeing a spherical object with a metallic sheen moving in a controlled path parallel to the carrier group. What made this event different was the attempt to document it. The photographer, according to later interviews, managed to capture images of the object using official Navy camera equipment. But shortly after the film was developed, it was seized by intelligence personnel on board. The images were never released, and the photographer was told not to speak about the event. Encounters like these weren't isolated to enlisted sailors or junior officers. In 1973, Marine Major George Filer, a respected intelligence officer, recounted an experience while aboard the Roosevelt. During a routine flight operation, pilots returning from a mission reported an unknown object pacing alongside their aircraft. The object, described as a glowing cigar-shaped craft, remained visible for over 10 minutes. Pilots reported that their instruments became erratic as they approached it. Upon landing, they filed incident reports. Filer was tasked with logging the event and preparing a summary. He later shared that the report was swiftly classified and removed from ship records by visiting intelligence officials. What stood out about these incidents wasn't just their frequency, but the silence that followed. Sailors were discouraged from discussing what they saw. In some cases, they were formally debriefed. In others, they simply understood without needing to be told that certain things were better left unsaid. The Roosevelt, like many naval vessels at the time, occasionally carried nuclear weapons. Though details remain classified, it's widely accepted among historians and former personnel that U.S. carriers in the Cold War routinely deployed with tactical nuclear arms. The proximity of these weapons to the reported sightings raised questions that few dared to explore at the time. During this period, similar encounters were reported aboard other Navy ships as well. The USS Coral Sea and the USS Saratoga both had incidents involving glowing objects observed over open water, often during times of high alert status or weapons drills. But none seemed to gather as many consistent reports as the Roosevelt. The open sea offered both visibility and isolation. With radar, sonar, and visual watch stations operating 247, naval vessels were some of the most heavily monitored environments in the military. When an object entered that domain, especially near a carrier with nuclear arms, it did not go unnoticed. Yet, despite documentation and witness testimony, official statements rarely followed. Some researchers believe this silence was intentional, that encounters at sea, particularly those involving strategic assets like nuclear carriers, were deemed too sensitive to disclose. Others believe the sightings were quietly investigated, but yielded no actionable findings and were buried to avoid panic or distraction from primary operations. In 2001, decades after the Roosevelt was decommissioned, several veterans who had served on board began to speak more openly. Interviews collected by civilian researchers and former naval officers detailed multiple incidents, sightings, radar contacts, and unexplained equipment malfunctions, all in the presence of unknown aerial objects. One technician recalled seeing strange blips on the radar, often dismissed as sea clutter by supervisors despite their consistent shape and velocity. Another described an object that mirrored the carrier's movements for several minutes before accelerating into the clouds and vanishing from sight. None of these accounts were sensationalized. In fact, they were understated. Careful, quiet recollections from men trained to observe and report with precision. The Roosevelt's encounters highlight a unique chapter in the broader pattern of unidentified aerial phenomena. While most public focus remains on sightings over land, military bases, missile silos, and power plants, the oceans have their stories too. And aboard one of the most heavily armed ships of its time, those stories accumulated silently. To this day, the full records of the USS Franklin D. Roosevelt's operations remain partly classified. What we do know is that over a span of more than 2 decades, during deployments in both peacetime and crisis, something unexplained appeared again and again in its airspace. Was it coincidence that these appearances occurred near a carrier with nuclear capabilities? Or was it part of a pattern, one that extended across branches, across nations, and across decades? The sailors who served on the Roosevelt don't claim to know, but they remember. They remember looking into the sky and seeing something that wasn't a plane, wasn't a star, and wasn't supposed to be there. And they remember the silence that followed. Chapter 5: Soviet Secrets and Shadows. The story of unidentified aerial phenomena is often told from a Western perspective, dominated by American radar logs, declassified Pentagon memos, and testimonies from U.S. military personnel. But behind the Iron Curtain, similar accounts were unfolding, often with eerie parallels. Hidden behind layers of Cold War secrecy, the Soviet Union maintained its own records of strange objects in the skies above its most sensitive military sites, including those that housed nuclear weapons. For decades, these accounts were silenced by tight controls over speech, media, and internal communication. Yet, after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, cracks began to appear in the wall of secrecy. Former officers, scientists, and even intelligence officials started sharing fragments of what they had once been ordered to conceal. And the pattern that emerged looked strikingly familiar. One of the most chilling and well-documented incidents took place in 1982 in the small town of Belokorovich, located in what is now northern Ukraine. At the time, the region was part of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic and home to a strategic nuclear missile base under Soviet command. On October 4th, 1982, personnel at the base reported strange aerial activity in the early evening hours. A large, disc-shaped object was seen hovering over the missile site. The object emitted no sound and remained motionless for nearly 15 minutes. Base security teams were placed on alert. Attempts to establish radio communication went unanswered. Then, without warning, the missile launch control systems activated. Lights began to flash on the command console. According to witnesses, launch sequences initiated themselves, uncommanded, unauthorized. For 15 full seconds, the base was in a state of extreme emergency. The command protocols for launching nuclear warheads appeared to be counting down. Just before the sequence reached the point of no return, the systems shut down. No personnel had touched the controls. No drills had been scheduled. No hardware failure was discovered. An investigation by high-ranking military officials followed immediately. Technicians were flown in from Moscow. The security staff were interrogated. The conclusion, which was not released to the public, stated that an unknown technical malfunction had caused the false launch sequence. But several officers involved, speaking years later under anonymity, were convinced the phenomenon was triggered externally. They also noted what happened immediately after the event. The strange object vanished into the clouds, moving upward at a sharp angle and disappearing in seconds. This incident was not the first of its kind in Soviet records. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, Soviet nuclear weapons sites had reported unexplained aerial incursions. A declassified Russian military archive, released partially in the 1990s by retired officers, contained accounts of glowing objects maneuvering above strategic airfields, missile storage depots, and submarine bases. In many cases, radar operators tracked the objects only to watch them disappear suddenly from scope. In one report from 1977, a formation of unknown craft was tracked for over 5 minutes above a ballistic missile site near Krasnoyarsk, Siberia. Witnesses described the objects as triangular, with pulsating lights and moving at speeds that defied known Soviet aircraft. The objects maintained a fixed altitude, then performed synchronized maneuvers before vanishing at high velocity. Soviet naval forces had their own encounters. In 1984, sailors aboard a Typhoon-class submarine in the Barents Sea observed an object moving underwater at extreme speeds, much faster than any known submarine. Though not strictly an aerial object, it triggered widespread speculation among naval officers about what it could be. Some called it a USO, an unidentified submerged object. Others believed it was a new American spy device. But no evidence of any Western technology matching the descriptions was ever found. In fact, Soviet scientists were formally assigned to investigate these incidents. One such team, led by Dr. Felix Zagel, a respected astronomer and military consultant, compiled reports for high-level defense committees. Zagel's team identified a high number of sightings, clustered around sensitive military zones, particularly those related to nuclear command and control systems. He attempted to present these findings to the Soviet Academy of Sciences, but the topic was politically taboo. His work was eventually dismissed as speculative, despite internal support from key defense analysts. The KGB also monitored reports of UFOs, not just within the USSR, but abroad. Declassified KGB files released after 1991 included summaries of American incidents, including Roswell, Malmstrom, and Minette, compiled from intercepted radio transmissions, open-source intelligence, and embedded sources. Soviet analysts were deeply interested in whether these events were real, and more importantly, whether they signaled an unknown foreign technology. But beyond intelligence gathering, there were also practical concerns. If unknown aerial craft could interfere with nuclear systems, as they seemingly did in Belo Corvice, that presented not just a mystery, but a serious security risk. In the early 1980s, the Soviet military quietly commissioned studies on electromagnetic anomalies affecting missile silos. One report, uncovered by Posts, Soviet researchers noted instances of guidance system disruption following low-altitude flyovers by unidentified objects. In most cases, no known aircraft were operating in the area. The files emphasized the need for enhanced shielding of control systems, but admitted that the source of interference remained unknown. Skeptics then and now have offered alternative explanations: power fluctuations, software errors, internal sabotage. Yet these same systems had been built with redundancies, hardened against known forms of interference, and the recurring presence of unknown objects during each failure event, confirmed by radar, visual sightings, and technical logs, could not easily be dismissed. By the late 1980s, under Gorbachev's policy of glasnost opus, limited press coverage of UFO phenomena began to appear in Soviet newspapers. Civilian sightings were mentioned, and older military encounters were alluded to, though still shrouded in vague language. A 1989 Pravda article even referenced intelligence-gathering craft of unknown origin seen near missile bases, though it stopped short of naming specific incidents. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, interest in these reports grew rapidly. Civilian researchers in Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus began collecting testimonies from former military personnel. Conferences were held. Declassified reports were analyzed. Patterns emerged, eerily similar to those reported in the West. Objects appearing over nuclear sites, systems shutting down without cause, structured craft performing maneuvers far beyond known aviation limits, silence from command authorities, and always the same quiet question: was someone or something monitoring our use of nuclear weapons. Today, these stories remain lesser known in the West. The Cold War kept them hidden behind walls of ideology and censorship. But they exist piece by piece in testimony and document, painting a parallel picture to the American narrative. A story of glowing discs above silos, of countdowns that began without human command, of technologies that seemed both curious and capable, and in the cold precision of Soviet missile facilities, where control and order were paramount. These intrusions left an impression that would not fade. Not with time, not with politics, and not with denial. Chapter 6: The Bentwaters Woodbridge File. In late December 1980, a string of events unfolded in a quiet forest in Suffolk, England. Events that would become one of the most significant and well-documented UFO encounters ever to involve U.S. military personnel stationed overseas. This was not a sighting by civilians or a second-hand rumor. It took place on NATO territory. It involved American servicemen trained in nuclear security, and it left behind physical traces. The twin bases of RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge, though under British ownership, were operated at the time by the United States Air Force. During the Cold War, they served as a major hub for U.S. operations in Europe. Officially, the U.S. denied that nuclear weapons were housed at the base. In reality, Bentwaters was one of the largest stockpiles of tactical nuclear arms in Western Europe. On the night of December 26, 1980, in the early hours of the 27th, security personnel at Woodbridge reported seeing lights descending into the Rendlesham forest, a wooded area just beyond the base perimeter. At first, they assumed it was an aircraft crash. But as patrols moved closer to investigate, what they encountered defied that assumption. According to first air-hand reports from airmen John Burroughs and Jim Peniston, a structured metallic object sat quietly between the trees. It emitted a soft glow, had a triangular shape, and bore unusual markings on its surface. It made no sound. The men reported approaching it, and in Peniston's case, even touching it. He later claimed the surface felt smooth and warm, and that strange symbols, resembling hieroglyphs, were etched into the hull. Suddenly, the object lifted vertically through the trees and disappeared at high speed. The following day, impressions were found in the ground where the object had allegedly landed. 3 triangular indentations, forming a perfect triangle. Radiation readings taken at the site registered slightly above background levels. Nearby branches appeared singed. Photographs were taken. Samples were collected. 2 nights later, on December 28th, the object returned. This time, a larger team was involved, led by Deputy Base Commander Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt. He carried a handheld tape recorder to document the experience in real time. The tape, which was later released to the public, captured the calm but increasingly tense voice of Halt as he described strange lights moving through the trees. At one point, Halt and his team observed a glowing red orb hovering at tree level. The object pulsed, then split into multiple smaller lights that moved through the forest silently. One of them appeared to beam a shaft of light down into the weapon storage area at Bentwaters. On the tape, Halt can be heard saying, "It's coming this way now. We're observing what appears to be a beam coming down to the ground. This is unreal." The encounter lasted several hours. Radar operators later confirmed an unidentified object had been tracked briefly over the area. Local law enforcement received reports of strange lights from nearby civilians. The event was formally logged in a memo written by Colonel Halt on January 13th, 1981. Known now as the Halt Memo. It summarized the events in neutral military language, but clearly stated that unidentified lights were seen by numerous individuals. The memo was sent to the UK Ministry of Defence, but was not widely circulated at the time. Years later, Colonel Halt would go much further. In public interviews and sworn testimony, he stated that he believed the objects encountered were under intelligent control and that the incident was deliberately downplayed by both US and UK authorities. He described how he was later warned not to discuss the event, and that key documents and radar logs mysteriously disappeared from official records. What makes the Bentwaters Woodbridge incident stand out is the convergence of multiple forms of evidence. Visual sightings by trained military personnel, physical indentations in the soil, unusual radiation readings, audio recordings, and official documentation. In 1994, researcher Georgina Brune uncovered additional MO'd Ministry of Defense to correspondence, showing that the incident had indeed been taken seriously at high levels. Though the MOD insisted there was no threat to national security, internal documents revealed concern about the presence of US nuclear weapons at the base, and whether the event might have constituted a breach. This quiet concern was echoed years later by Nick Pope, a former MOD investigator who handled UFO cases during the 1990s. He described Bentwaters as the UK's Roswell, not because of recovered material, but because of the depth and quality of military involvement. Still, official responses remained muted. No follow-up investigation was ever publicly acknowledged by NATO or the US Air Force. The radiation readings were dismissed as inconclusive. The ground impressions were attributed to forest activity, and the eyewitnesses were left with questions. over time, more witnesses came forward. In 2010, a group of former U.S. servicemen held a press conference in Washington, D.C., calling for the release of classified files related to the incident. They stated that the public deserved to know what was encountered near nuclear weapons storage areas on foreign soil. They also suggested that these were not isolated events. Similar objects, they said, had been seen near missile silos in the US and bases in Europe. The pattern was becoming difficult to ignore. What happened at Bentwaters Woodbridge was not simply a light in the sky. It was a coordinated, multi-ite encounter involving base security, senior command personnel, and physical effects on the environment. It took place next to and possibly over one of NATO's most critical nuclear storage depots during the height of the Cold War, and it was never explained. Some researchers have speculated that the objects were advanced reconnaissance platforms, perhaps Soviet, perhaps experimental NATO craft. Others believe the beams of light and surveillance-like behavior point to a form of external monitoring. But monitoring by what or whom remains open to debate. Colonel Halt has stood by his account for over 40 years. He maintains that what he saw was not conventional. He believes it was intelligently controlled, and he has repeatedly expressed concern about the potential vulnerability of nuclear installations to unknown aerial intrusions. The Rendlesham Forest remains a quiet place today. A small trail now marks the route where the airmen walked. A metal plaque explains the event briefly, though not conclusively. No debris was ever found. No official explanation has ever been issued that satisfied all the facts. But the evidence, once scattered in whispers and memos, now sits in public view, in audio tapes, in testimony, in declassified summaries, and in the soil beneath the pine trees of Suffolk. And for those who were there, the night when the unknown came to the edge of the nuclear threshold remains clear, etched in memory, like the strange symbols on the side of a silent craft. Chapter 7. The phenomenon spreads Israel, India, and China. For much of the 20th century, discussions about unidentified aerial phenomena near nuclear facilities focused heavily on the United States and, to a lesser extent, the former Soviet Union. But as nuclear technology spread across continents, the pattern of strange visitations followed. From the deserts of Israel to the coastlines of southern India and the industrial sprawl of China's nuclear research centers, sightings began to surface, many of them echoing the same characteristics observed in the West. These incidents rarely made international headlines. In countries where secrecy surrounding nuclear infrastructure is strict and dissent is tightly managed, such stories often emerged only years later through witness testimony or leaked documents. But when they did emerge, they revealed that the phenomenon was not bounded by language, politics, or hemispheres. It was global. One of the earliest known non-Western cases connected to nuclear facilities took place in Diona, Israel. Deep in the Negev desert, the Diona Nuclear Research Center has long been the subject of intense speculation. Officially referred to as a reactor for peaceful energy research, it has widely been considered the core of Israel's undeclared nuclear weapons program. In the late 1970s, multiple reports began to surface of unidentified craft seen hovering over or near the facility. According to retired Israeli Air Force personnel, several scramble alerts were triggered during this period. Fighter jets were dispatched toward radar contacts that seemed to hover at high altitudes only to vanish when approached. In one specific incident from 1981, an object was reportedly seen hovering silently over the base for over 5 minutes. It emitted a bluish glow and performed a vertical ascent at high speed, all without setting off sonic booms. Ground observers noted that the object appeared to cast no shadow in the midday sun. Though no photographs were ever released, internal defense sources later confirmed that radar logs did show a trackable object, one that did not match the flight signature of any known aircraft at the time. Israel's military quietly increased aerial patrols around the facility after the incident. No explanation was ever made public. Israeli officials have never officially acknowledged the event, consistent with their policy of strict secrecy surrounding Diona. But among retired intelligence officers, the incident remains an unspoken marker. Another instance when something entered restricted airspace and then vanished without trace. Thousands of kilometers to the east, another story was unfolding. This time in southern India, at the Kalpakkam nuclear power plant, located near the Bay of Bengal in Tamil Nadu. In October 2004, shortly after the devastating Indian Ocean tsunami, local news outlets reported an unusual sighting near the facility. Several fishermen and plant workers described seeing a glowing object in the early morning sky, hovering above the reactor complex for several minutes. Unlike aircraft, it made no sound and emitted a pulsing red light. Initially thought to be a military drone, the object shape and behavior did not match anything familiar. Multiple witnesses described it as disc-like and rotating slowly as it hovered in place. According to unofficial sources, Indian security forces increased their presence at the site for several weeks following the incident. Researchers in India's civilian UFO community, small but persistent, later published interviews with plant employees who, under condition of anonymity, claimed that this was not the first such event. At least 3 previous incidents had occurred since the late 1990s, all involving silent craft appearing at night above the Kalpakam facility. These accounts were never investigated publicly. The Indian Department of Atomic Energy declined to comment, and the Air Force denied any unusual radar activity. But what stood out was the repeated nature of the sightings, always near nuclear infrastructure, always involving structured craft, and always vanishing before interception could occur. India's growing nuclear arsenal, both civilian and military, seemed to be quietly attracting the same pattern of observation that had been seen in the US, Russia, and Israel. To the north, in China, the situation was even more opaque. As one of the world's most secretive states when it comes to military affairs, China has historically avoided any public discussion of unidentified aerial phenomena. Still, leaked reports, civilian witness statements, and limited regional press coverage point to a consistent and closely guarded presence of UFO sightings near nuclear sites. In 2009, residents of Liangshan, a city in Sichuan province, observed a large cigar-shaped object hovering in the night sky near a known nuclear materials facility. Videos taken on mobile phones showed a glowing bar of light that remained stationary for over 10 minutes before disappearing suddenly. The videos spread quickly online before being taken down by censors. Independent researchers, both inside and outside China, traced the location to an area close to the Lash's nuclear power base, a sensitive facility involved in fuel processing. Though the government offered no statement, additional eyewitnesses later confirmed that military aircraft were seen circling the area shortly after the object appeared. In Xinjiang province, where one of China's earliest nuclear testing grounds, Lapnor, is located, strange aerial sightings have been reported by local herders and border patrols since the 1980s. Though harder to verify, some accounts describe glowing orbs and structured objects that silently moved across the sky before vanishing into the desert. Military presence in the region makes independent investigation almost impossible. But the consistency of reports over decades suggests that the phenomenon is not unknown to Chinese defense circles. A Chinese academic paper published quietly in 2012, which escaped censorship for a time, made note of unexplained aerial phenomena recorded during technical operations at several restricted installations. While the language was vague, the implication was clear. Certain sightings had taken place at nuclear-adjacent sites, and the nature of the objects observed was not understood. Whether in the Negev, the Bay of Bengal, or the deserts of Xinjiang, the same themes reappear. Objects moving in ways that defy known aerodynamics, appearing in or near nuclear installations, often during periods of heightened activity or unrest. They are observed by trained personnel, recorded by radar, and quickly dismissed or hidden by national authorities. Some argue these are advanced surveillance drones, either from rival states or internal blacks. Others suggest unknown atmospheric phenomena or instrumentation errors. But what makes these events compelling is their recurring association with the most sensitive sites humanity has built. In places where nuclear energy is split, where weapons are assembled, where materials are enriched, these objects appear. They do not seem hostile. They do not make contact, but they watch. And across cultures, across languages, and across continents, the quiet observation continues. Chapter 8. The Missile Shutdown Patterns. In the realm of nuclear command and control, redundancy is paramount. Every system, from launch authorization protocols to missile readiness checks, is built with layers of fail-safes, backups, and hardened shielding to prevent malfunction. These safeguards are designed to withstand human error, sabotage, cyber attack, and even electromagnetic interference. Yet, despite these precautions, something has repeatedly managed to bypass those layers quietly and without explanation. Across multiple continents and decades, a curious and consistent phenomenon has emerged. Nuclear missile systems suddenly going offline. Not due to mechanical failure, not from external tampering, but coinciding again and again with the appearance of unidentified aerial objects. The pattern began to take shape with the Monstrum Air Force Base incident in 1967, which we examined earlier. In that case, 10 Minuteman ICBMs were rendered inoperative shortly after a UFO was observed hovering above the silo complex. Technicians found no fault in the system. The missiles simply transitioned from alert status to offline, one after another. At the time, this was seen as a stand-alone event, but it wasn't. In 1975, missile sites across the northern tier of the United States, including Luring AFB in Maine, Malmstrom in Montana, and Minne in North Dakota, experienced security breaches from unidentified aerial craft. These intrusions were taken seriously enough to prompt high-level alerts. Unknown lights were seen maneuvering over restricted launch areas, triggering responses from security teams and scrambling of jet interceptors. In some cases, missile crews reported short-lived but unexplained disruptions in status indicators. No formal shutdowns were logged, but the interference was noted. In 1979, at Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming, another pattern emerged. On multiple occasions, Air Force Corps officers reported sightings of bright, disc-shaped craft above missile fields. Radar operators tracked unknown targets moving at low altitude, performing controlled turns above ICBM installations. Though the missiles did not shut down, security footage and radar logs were quietly archived. A former base commander, speaking anonymously, years later referred to the events as unacknowledged intrusions with unknown intent. But the most dramatic shutdown since Monstrum occurred not in the United States, but in Soviet Ukraine in the town of Belokorovich, as previously covered in Chapter 5. In 1982, missile officers witnessed an object hovering silently over the base. Without warning, control systems began initiating launch sequences on their own. For nearly 15 seconds, it appeared as if nuclear missiles were being prepared to fire. Then, just as suddenly, the system reset. No launch occurred. No cause was found. This case was remarkable, not just for its similarity to Malmstrom, but for its added gravity. An unauthorized countdown had actually begun. The proximity of these intrusions to launch critical components suggested not passive observation, but interaction. In both cases, there was no sign of physical tampering, no power fluctuation, no electromagnetic surge that could explain the event. Years later, retired officers from both nations, once Cold War adversaries, would come forward, unaware at the time that the other side had experienced nearly identical events. What had been interpreted in the 1960s and 70s as possible espionage or adversarial interference was now viewed through a broader lens. These weren't isolated security breaches. They were part of a recurring global phenomenon. By the 1990s, with the Cold War over and military archives slowly opening, researchers began comparing these incidents side by side. The consistency was striking. Each case had taken place at or near an operational nuclear missile facility. All of them involved visual sightings or radar confirmation of unidentified aerial objects. In every instance, systems experienced failures or uncommanded disruptions that could not be traced to technical faults or human error. Yet despite the severity of the interference, none of these incidents resulted in physical damage or a permanent loss of function. And in all cases, the objects responsible vanished without a trace, leaving no debris, no signature, and no explanation. To date, no known military aircraft, domestic or foreign, has been demonstrated to possess the capability to remotely disable multiple independent missile systems, especially those spread across vast distances with no central control point. The idea that an adversarial power could intrude on such secure infrastructure without detection or trace borders is implausible. Even more compelling was the behavior of the intruding objects. They never intact. They never attempted communication. They hovered. They observed. And in some cases, they seemed to interact, just enough to render the systems temporarily inoperative. Some observers have suggested these incidents were tests. Probes, perhaps, to assess nuclear capabilities or response readiness. Others argue they were warnings, a demonstration of power meant to dissuade further weapons escalation. And some speculate they were part of a monitoring system tracking human nuclear activity with an interest beyond geopolitics. During a 2010 press conference at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., several former U.S. Air Force officers presented sworn testimony describing these shutdown incidents in detail. Among them were Robert Salissa from Malmstrom and Charles Halt from the Bentwaters Woodbridge incident. They called on the U.S. government to declassify all records of unidentified aerial intrusions at nuclear sites. Their message was calm, but clear. These were not random events. They formed a pattern, and that pattern had implications for national and global security. To date, their call has gone unanswered. While some documents have been released under the Freedom of Information Act, others remain redacted or classified. In several cases, documentation is known to have existed, but has gone missing. Erased logs, misfiled reports, tapes that were accidentally recorded over. This lack of transparency has done little to calm speculation. If anything, it has pushed former insiders to speak more openly. In interviews conducted in the 2010s, retired missile maintenance officers have described the aftermath of these shutdowns as chaotic. Investigative teams would arrive quickly. Personnel would be debriefed, and then silence would follow. Many of the incidents were never acknowledged in official timelines. They were omitted from base histories, overlooked in public relations materials, and absent from standard incident reports. Some airmen were required to sign non-disclosure agreements. Others simply understood that speaking out could jeopardize their careers. Still, the testimony continues to grow. From Montana to Ukraine, from North Dakota to Siberia, the stories are the same. Lights in the sky, silent craft hovering over silos, warning lights blinking on control panels, systems going dark, and always the same conclusion. No conventional cause could be found. The implications of these incidents remain difficult to digest. In a world where nuclear deterrence depends on absolute control and reliability, the idea that external forces, whether adversarial or unknown, can interfere with that control is profoundly unsettling. Yet, that is exactly what the evidence suggests. This is not speculation. It is not mythology. It is data collected, confirmed, and archived by military professionals in some of the most secure environments on Earth. And in those silos beneath layers of steel and earth, the silence that follows each shutdown speaks louder than any alarm. Something is watching. Something has the capability to reach inside the most guarded systems known to humankind. Whether it is a test, a warning, or something else entirely, the pattern has been made clear, and it is still unfolding. Chapter 9. The files they didn't want opened. For decades, the official stance of governments around the world has been simple. Unidentified aerial phenomena are either misidentifications, natural events, or experimental aircraft. Nothing to be alarmed about, nothing to confirm. But behind closed doors, a very different picture has emerged. A picture built slowly through the release of classified files, testimony from insiders, and documents obtained through persistent use of the Freedom of Information Act. From the late 1940s to the end of the 1960s, the U.S. Air Force operated a series of investigative efforts into what were then referred to simply as flying saucers. These programs evolved from Project Sign to Project Grudge, and eventually to the most well-known Project Blue Book. Officially, Blue Book was established in 1952 to determine whether UFOs posed a threat to national security. By the time the project ended in 1969, it had investigated over 12,000 cases. The vast majority, the Air Force claimed, could be explained. Weather balloons, Venus, aircraft, reflections. But over 700 cases remained unexplained. And more importantly, the conclusions of Blue Book did not always align with internal assessments. One such example involves a 1965 incident at the Wartith Air Force Base in Michigan, where personnel tracked a glowing object near a nuclear weapons storage area. Blue Book classified the case as insufficient data, but an internal Air Force intelligence memo, later declassified, noted that the object demonstrated unusual flight characteristics inconsistent with known technology. Over time, it became clear that Project Blue Book was not just a research initiative, but a public relations effort. The goal, in part, was to provide explanations that reduced public concern. High-ranking officials, including Air Force physicist Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who initially served as Blue Book's scientific advisor, later admitted that many cases were dismissed too quickly and with insufficient investigation. Heck eventually became one of the most respected civilian researchers of UFO phenomena, deeply critical of the project he once helped manage. Even as Blue Book closed its doors, the phenomenon did not go away, and neither did the documentation. Starting in the 1980s, American researchers began using the Freedom of Information Act to uncover what the government hadn't told the public. The resulting documents painted a far more complex picture than official statements suggested. FOIA releases revealed that UFOs had repeatedly been observed near sensitive military installations, including nuclear missile silos, submarine bases, and nuclear weapons labs. Some documents were heavily redacted, entire pages blacked out, but enough remained to confirm that the US government had taken these sightings seriously. A 1975 NORAD memo, for instance, discussed repeated incursions by unknown aerial craft over several nuclear bases in the northern tier of the United States. The memo acknowledged that fighter jets had been scrambled but failed to intercept the objects, the term used to describe them, unidentified helicopters. But eyewitness reports and radar data contradicted that label. These were not helicopters. They were silent, fast and moving, and capable of hovering for long periods, well beyond the capabilities of rower craft at the time. In another FOIA-released memo from 1976, an Air Force officer stationed at Kirtland AFB in New Mexico documented sightings of glowing objects near the Manzano weapons storage area, one of the most secure nuclear stockpiles in the country. The report included detailed diagrams, timing logs, and light spectrum analysis. The conclusion: no known aircraft or atmospheric condition can account for the observed events. Other documents, uncovered by FOIA users, revealed that some incident routes were classified far above routine clearance levels. References to restricted code word access and compartmentalized intelligence suggested that certain UFO reports were handled with the same sensitivity as the nation's most protected nuclear secrets. Even more puzzling was the lack of follow-up. In case after case, internal memos acknowledge the credibility of the sightings, often corroborated by radar pilots and ground personnel, but then recommended no further action. It was as if the phenomenon was being observed, recorded, and then shelved. By the early 2000s, public interest in government UFO secrecy had waned. But inside the Pentagon, something else was happening. In 2017, investigative journalists revealed the existence of a previously undisclosed program, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, AATIP, funded with $22 million of black budget money. AATIP operated within the Department of Defense from 2007 to at least 2012, and possibly longer. Its mission to investigate reports of unidentified aerial objects, particularly those that posed a potential threat to military assets. AIP analyzed dozens of encounters, including those involving nuclear-related incidents, though many of its findings remain classified. The few details that have emerged suggest that these objects displayed flight characteristics far beyond known technology, including sudden acceleration, hypersonic speed without sonic booms, and the ability to hover silently for extended periods. One of the program's contractors, aerospace executive Dr. Hal Puthoff, stated publicly that some of the materials studied under AATIP included exotic metamaterials, substances allegedly recovered from unknown craft. These claims remain controversial and unverified, but they further fueled speculation that the U.S. government had long known more than it was admitting. More recently, in 2020 and 2021, the U.S. Department of Defense formally acknowledged the authenticity of several UAP videos taken by Navy pilots. These videos, showing small, fast-moving objects performing maneuvers impossible with known aircraft, were part of a new wave of official disclosure. Congress responded by ordering further investigations and requiring the intelligence community to produce periodic reports. In June 2021, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, ODNI, released a preliminary report. It stated that of 144 military reported UAP sightings between 2004 and 2021, only one could be explained. The rest remained unresolved. The report stopped short of mentioning nuclear connections. But in a follow-up hearing in 2022, several representatives specifically asked whether UAPs had been observed near U.S. nuclear facilities. The answer, though vague, was yes. Still, official documents often tell only part of the story. For every memo released under FOIA, there are others still hidden. For every report acknowledged, others remain classified. And for every official who steps forward, there are many more who remain silent, bound by non-disclosure agreements, security oaths, or simply the weight of doubt. Perhaps that is why the most revealing documents are often the ones that were never meant to be seen. Raw intelligence briefings, handwritten logs, radar transcripts scribbled under pressure. They speak not in polished language or rehearsed conclusions, but in real-time uncertainty. A security officer noting object hovered over silo. No sound. Control systems flickered. A radar tech writing, "Return moved erratically. Impossible speed. Lost track at 60,000 feet." A debriefing officer remarking, "Witnesses credible. No explanation offered." These are not the files meant for public consumption, but they exist. And together, they form a hidden record, not of alien visitation necessarily, but of something persistent, intelligent, and uninvited. The files they didn't want opened tell a story the public was never supposed to hear. A story of shadows over silos, lights that blinked out missiles, and a mystery that reached into the heart of humanity's most destructive technology. It is not a story of answers, but it is a record, and the pattern it reveals grows clearer with every uncovered page. Chapter 10: Eyewitnesses in Uniform. For most of their careers, they said nothing. Bound by security clearances, duty, and the weight of disbelief, they kept their experiences sealed behind military walls. But over time, after retirement and reflection, a number of former service members, men and women with decades of experience, trained to report only what they could verify, stepped into the public light with accounts that had haunted them since their days in uniform. They weren't conspiracy theorists. They weren't chasing notoriety. They were radar operators, missile technicians, pilots, and base commanders. And what they described calmly and consistently were events that defied conventional explanation. Many of them tied directly to the most secure military assets on Earth: nuclear weapons. Among the first to speak publicly was Captain Robert Salas, a U.S. Air Force missile launch officer stationed at Malmstrom Air Force Base in 1967. Salas had already gone on record in earlier chapters of this narrative, but his calm and detailed retellings deserve attention here again. He was underground on duty in the Launch Control Center when the missiles under his command suddenly went offline. Above ground, security personnel reported a glowing red object hovering over the silo. Years later, Salas described the incident not with drama, but with clarity. He recounted the systematic shutdown of multiple Minuteman ICBMs, each going from alert to no-go status with no discernible cause. At first, he assumed it was a technical glitch, until the calls from security above ground made it clear something unusual was occurring outside. Salas didn't go public until decades later, long after he'd left the military. Even then, he was measured in tone. "I'm not claiming little green men," he once said in an interview. "I'm just saying something with capabilities far beyond ours interfered with our most powerful weapons." He wasn't alone. Colonel Charles Halt, deputy base commander at RAF Bentwaters in the United Kingdom, also spoke out years after his own experience. In December 1980, Halt led a team of servicemen into Rendlesham Forest to investigate strange lights. What he saw, structured craft maneuvering silently, beaming light into the base's weapon storage area, left him stunned. He captured part of the event on audio tape and later filed an official memorandum with the U.S. Air Force. Halt's credibility is hard to dispute. A career officer with a calm demeanor and a no-nonsense approach. He stated flatly, "This was something beyond our understanding. It was real, and it was not from any military force on this planet. Other accounts followed. Major George Filer, a U.S. Air Force intelligence officer and flight controller, served aboard aircraft carriers and air bases during the Cold War. In one case, he recalled receiving a report from a fighter pilot who had locked onto a fast-moving unknown object. Before he could fire, the object accelerated and disappeared. Filer documented the encounter, but the report was quietly buried. He later said, "We were told not to pursue it further, but I knew what I saw on radar. That object was not ours, and it wasn't theirs either." In 2001, at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., a group of retired military officers held a public conference organized by the Disclosure Project. Among them were missile launch officers, radar specialists, and intelligence analysts. They spoke of objects hovering over launch sites, disabling control systems, and departing at speeds that defied physics. One of them, Lieutenant Colonel Dwin Arnerson, who served as a communications officer at Malmstrom AFB, confirmed that messages about UFOs disabling missiles were routinely passed through secure military channels. Never acknowledged openly, but never denied internally either. Another speaker, Captain Bruce Fenster, described a glowing object hovering over a missile site in Colorado in the 1970s. The missile's guidance system failed shortly after the sighting. He submitted a report which was later classified. Notably, these officers weren't all from the same base or time period. They came from different decades, different regions, even different branches of the armed forces. Yet their stories, independently verified and corroborated, followed the same outline. Unknown aerial craft appearing near nuclear facilities, sometimes triggering systems failures, always leaving without trace. And it wasn't just Americans. Colonel Boris Sokolov, a retired Soviet defense official, confirmed in a post-Cold War interview that Russian military personnel had also encountered unidentified craft near their nuclear weapons depots. He described a case in which objects appeared over missile bases in Ukraine, triggering uncommanded changes in launch status, similar to the 1982 Bayel-Korovice incident discussed in Chapter 5. In France, retired Air Force General Denis Lay participated in a government IFIA-funded study on UFOs known as the Cometa Report, published in 1999. The report concluded that some UFOs appeared to be of extraterrestrial origin, and noted that many of the most serious cases involved strategic military assets, including nuclear sites. What united these testimonies wasn't belief. It was observation. These were trained individuals operating in environments where every movement, every anomaly was recorded and scrutinized. They had been taught to remain calm under pressure, to log everything with precision, to speak only to what they could confirm. And what they confirmed was this. Again and again, over decades, unidentified objects penetrated restricted airspace, interacted with nuclear systems, and departed without detection or interception. Why did they choose to speak out? For many, it wasn't an easy decision. Some had been warned not to discuss the incidents. Others feared ridicule. But as years passed and their careers ended, many felt a responsibility to the public, not to provoke fear, but to encourage awareness, to demand transparency, and to confirm beyond doubt that something unusual had taken place. In interviews, many of these eyewitnesses expressed frustration. They were not calling for panic or assumptions of alien visitation. They were simply calling for honesty. If unknown craft can disable nuclear weapons, even temporarily, shouldn't the public know? If global military personnel have observed this pattern for half a century, isn't that worth further inquiry? They weren't asking for belief. They were offering evidence, the kind collected not by theorists, but by men and women trained to defend nations. Their uniforms may now be folded away, their tours of duty long finished, but their voices remain steady, and their stories remain consistent. And together, those stories ask one quiet, persistent question. If so many of our most trusted defenders saw the same thing, what is it we've been defending against? Chapter 11. Modern Incursions and the 21st Century. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, the conversation surrounding unidentified aerial phenomena, now rebranded in official discourse as UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena, began to change. So did the tools used to monitor the skies. Radar systems grew more precise. Surveillance satellites became more numerous, and sensor data more sophisticated. Despite this progress, or perhaps because of it, the mysterious intrusions into nuclear-adjacent airspace didn't stop. In fact, they continued. Only now, they left behind better evidence. In April 2004, at Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico, motion-activated security cameras captured a glowing orb maneuvering silently over one of the lab's restricted areas. The object appeared suddenly in the infrared spectrum and then drifted out of frame. Though no official comment was made, civilian researchers later learned of the incident through a whistleblower involved in site security. Los Alamos, of course, holds special significance. It was the birthplace of the atomic bomb and continues to play a central role in nuclear weapons development and monitoring. The incident drew immediate comparisons to earlier sightings in the same region. Sightings that had occurred decades earlier during the Manhattan Project. but now equipped with better tracking systems and digital recording technology. In 2006, a more public incident unfolded in the skies over O'Hare International Airport in Chicago. Multiple airline employees, including ground crew and pilots, witnessed a dark disc-shaped object hovering silently above one of the terminals. It then shot straight upward through the cloud layer, leaving a clean, circular hole. The FAA initially dismissed the incident, stating that radar had picked up nothing unusual, but internal reports and air traffic control audio leaked to the press, confirming the seriousness of the sighting and the credibility of the witnesses. Though not tied to a nuclear facility, the O'Hare case was another reminder that highly trained observers, including commercial pilots and aviation personnel, continued to encounter structured, unexplained objects in controlled airspace. But more direct links to nuclear sites soon followed. Between 2010 and 2015, a cluster of UAP sightings emerged around the Hanford site in Washington state, a former nuclear weapons production complex and one of the most contaminated nuclear waste storage areas in the world. Security contractors reported seeing orbs of light hovering above the tanks that held radioactive waste. According to internal memos shared with investigative journalist George Knapp, helicopters were dispatched, but found nothing on thermal or radar scans. The Hanford orbs appeared repeatedly over the span of several years. In one case, infrared security cameras captured a glowing object hovering over the B reactor area. In another, lights were seen maneuvering around cranes, positioned above sealed waste tunnels. These events were quietly noted in DOE logs, but were not disclosed to the public. When questioned by reporters, DOE representatives stated that no threat had been detected. Meanwhile, new incursions were being reported by the U.S. Navy. In 2014 and 2015, pilots from the USS Theodore Roosevelt Strike Group began encountering objects during training maneuvers off the eastern seaboard of the United States. The UAPs, which appeared daily over a span of several months, were described as cube-shaped objects inside transparent spheres, capable of hovering, accelerating, and changing direction instantly. In some cases, the objects came dangerously close to Navy jets, prompting the pilots to file near misses reports. Unlike earlier decades, these incidents were recorded using the Navy's advanced Rathon A SQ-228 advanced targeting, forward-looking infrared ATLIR pod, which captured heat signatures and movement. Some of this footage, including the now famous gimbal and go fast videos, was later released to the public by the Pentagon. While these incidents didn't occur directly over nuclear missile fields, they involved aircraft and operations connected to U.S. strategic forces, some of which may have been conducting training exercises involving nuclear payload readiness. Navy witnesses, including Lieutenant Ryan Graves, emphasized that the objects were not part of any known military program, and that their presence was ongoing, persistent, and unexplained. The Department of Defense, for the first time in decades, acknowledged the legitimacy of these encounters. In 2017, through investigative reporting by the New York Times and others, it was revealed that the Pentagon had been running a secretive program called AATIP, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. AATIP had analyzed UAP incidents across branches, and some of the cases involved nuclear facilities or weapon systems. More telling was the testimony given in 2021 and 2022 during congressional hearings. Defense officials under oath admitted that UAPs had been observed near sensitive military infrastructure, including nuclear facilities. While specifics were withheld in open session, several lawmakers pushed for classified briefings citing security implications. In parallel, civilian reports continued to accumulate around nuclear-related sites. In 2020, in Oakage, Tennessee, home to the Y-12 National Security Complex, residents reported a triangular craft moving silently above the tree line. The Y-12 facility, which has long been involved in uranium enrichment and weapons maintenance, has been a hot spot of historical sightings dating back to the 1950s. The 2020 incident sparked renewed interest due to its visual similarity to sightings described decades earlier by plant workers. In France, a leaked Jean Armory report from 2021 described a series of unidentified objects seen above the Marul nuclear site, a location tied to both civilian and military nuclear research. A patrol unit reported being shadowed by a glowing object for several kilometers, which then hovered above one of the cooling towers. The official report concluded only that no known aircraft was operating in the area. What stands out about these modern incursions is how they mirror earlier incidents in both behavior and context. The same flight characteristics are reported: hovering, sudden acceleration, absence of sound, and no visible propulsion. The same locations are involved: missile fields, storage depots, enrichment facilities, and weapons labs. Yet, the nature of the reporting has changed. Today, sensor data is more precise. There are videos, telemetry records, radar echoes, and electromagnetic readings. UAPs are being captured on infrared cameras and verified by multiple platforms: air, sea, and space-based. And perhaps most importantly, the stigma around reporting has begun to erode, allowing more pilots, analysts, and security personnel to come forward. Still, there is no clear answer. In a July 2023 update from the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office A, the successor to AAIP, officials confirmed that hundreds of additional UAP sightings were under investigation. Several involved objects in restricted airspace. A few were reported directly above strategic military sites. None had yet been identified. Despite this, the government maintains that there is no evidence as these objects are extraterrestrial. But it also admits they are not currently attributed to any known foreign adversary or domestic program. For the public, the question remains suspended. In the 21st century, with more tools than ever to observe the skies, we continue to encounter visitors we do not understand, moving with intent, bypassing our defenses and occasionally appearing where our most dangerous technologies are stored. And while the terminology has evolved from flying saucer to UAP, the phenomenon remains the same. Silent, capable, and watching. Chapter 12. What are they protecting or watching? After decades of data, testimonies, declassified files, sensor footage, and quiet confessions from those in uniform, one question remains. What exactly are these unidentified aerial phenomena doing near our nuclear weapons? Across chapters, we've traced incidents stretching from the deserts of New Mexico in 1945 to the missile fields of Montana, the forests of England, the plains of Ukraine, and the waters of the Pacific. We've examined shutdowns of missile systems, silent intrusions over storage bunkers, and objects tracked on radar, but seen by no known satellite or plane. In each case, the pattern persisted, calm, methodical, and detached from human conflict. But the intent behind it all has remained elusive. Are these intrusions observational? Are these objects, whatever they are, monitoring our most destructive capabilities, simply watching? Or are they tests, interventions, warnings? The evidence does not suggest hostility. In more than 70 years of sightings near nuclear facilities, no attack has taken place. No weapons have been triggered. No damage has been done beyond temporary system disruption. In fact, in many cases, missiles were rendered inoperative, not enabled. Silos went offline. Launch sequences aborted. Radar systems scrambled briefly, only to recover moments later. For some, this points to a pattern of deterrence. If an outside intelligence wanted to prevent nuclear war without direct engagement, the act of quietly neutralizing our weapons, or simply reminding us that they can be neutralized, might serve as a subtle but powerful statement. This theory aligns with the timing of many major incidents. The first waves of sightings came shortly after the detonation of the first atomic bomb, in 1945. Subsequent flurries of activity followed each nuclear milestone. The Soviet Union's first successful test in 1949, the expansion of missile silos in the 1960s, the proliferation of tactical nuclear weapons aboard naval vessels, and even the underground storage of radioactive waste in the 21st century. In each case, sightings rose not near civilian airfields or population centers, but near locations central to the operation, development, or control of nuclear arms. This consistency has led some researchers to propose what they call the observer hypothesis. It suggests that these phenomena are not threats in the conventional sense, not invading or attacking, but rather maintaining a presence, watching closely whenever humanity touches the most dangerous thresholds of technology. There is no certainty as to what these observers might be. Interpretations range from extraterrestrial intelligence to advanced surveillance systems operated by a yet unidentified nation or group. Others entertain possibilities involving time travelers or interdimensional entities. But whatever the source, the behavior is consistent. Approach, observe, interfere subtly, and leave. The interference itself has been particularly telling during the Mistrum and Belorovich incidents. Missile systems were not damaged, but deactivated, as if someone or something wanted to demonstrate control, not cause destruction. The command systems shut down on their own, triggered by nothing internal, reactivating just as mysteriously as they had failed. It was not sabotage. It was precision. The idea of external interest in our nuclear capabilities is not new. In 1982, former U.S. Air Force intelligence officers began discussing the concept informally. If we are being watched, what exactly are they watching for? One possibility they suggested was threshold behavior. Perhaps our development of nuclear weapons marked a crossing, a line of technological maturity that triggered automatic observation. Much like scientists monitoring early nuclear reactions in a lab, perhaps we too became the subject of observation once we reached a certain capability, one that could not be reversed and could not go unnoticed. This line of thinking was echoed by Colonel Charles Halt, who speculated in later interviews that we may be dealing with something monitoring how we handle technologies we do not fully understand. In his view, the Rendlesham incident was not just a random sighting, but a carefully executed surveillance of NATO's nuclear posture. Others suggest that these events serve as psychological signals, subtle reminders to those in power that no weapon is absolute, that even our most secure systems can be touched without warning, that human control over life and death is perhaps not as complete as we imagine. And then there is the darker possibility that these objects are not watching for our benefit, but for their own. Some fear that these craft, whoever controls them, are not preventing nuclear war, but studying it, mapping its systems, measuring its consequences, not to stop us, but to learn from us, from our mistakes, from our evolution. Yet such a motive is speculative. What we do have consistently is a record of non-lethal interactions, deliberate avoidance of conflict, and movements that suggest observation without confrontation. Even when intercepted by jet fighters, these objects do not engage. They leave quickly, sometimes instantly, but without retaliation. As the years pass, the terminology continues to evolve. UFO gave way to UAP. Today, agencies speak of anomalous objects, unattributed aerial systems, or transmedium craft. But the phenomenon remains the same. Silhouettes in the night sky, glows above the silos, systems going dark, and silence. For those who have served in the shadows of these events, the memory does not fade. Retired officers, pilots, and technicians still ask the same questions. Why here? Why then? And why always near the weapons? Some have begun to accept that an answer may never come. Others believe we are on the cusp of disclosure, that buried within government archives and classified programs lie deeper truths yet to be revealed. But for most, the truth is already clear, even if incomplete. Something is present. It behaves intelligently. It responds to our weapons, our movements, our actions. And it has been doing so since the first nuclear fire lit the desert sky in 1945.